Okay, let's talk about glazing. Now, the whole subject of glazing is just massive. There are literally thousands of different types of glazing units you can go for. You can choose different frames, thermally broken, aluminium, PVC, timber, and there's even more options around glazing itself. What kind of glass will you have? How thick is a glass? What's the distance between each pane of glass and double or triple glazed windows? Do you have mirroring on the outside? Do you have low E? Do you have argon? What do you do? There are so many different options to consider, and the only way to get a real answer about this is to do an energy model of your house, where it is, how big it is, what's the story with the orientation to the sun, how are you going to use it, will you be opening the windows, how hot will that glass get, are there any trees around it, are there any neighbouring houses that are going to impact you as well. Getting an accurate model will allow you to determine and pick the right level of glass, because glass can be very, very expensive. In my own house, I went for a mirrored glass with low E. I didn't go for argon because I think it's a bit of nonsense. However, the extra cost for my own place to have a high spec glass was $140 a linear metre, and I did a lot of modelling to work out the impact that that would have on my energy cost overall and how big my mechanical plant. What is mechanical plant, you say? Well, that's the heating system and the cooling system I have in my house. Let's talk about low E coatings. This is a really common one that a lot of glazing manufacturers like to sell. It is a thin film of aluminium which is baked on. Now, as you can see from the chart in front of you, you've got the warm yellow wavelength light coming in. It's not yellow in reality, but let's just pretend it is. Just for the purpose here, you've got this warm yellow light coming into your house. As you can see, the wavelength is quite small. It gets all the way inside. A little bit gets rejected outside, but most of it comes in. The heat that you and I reject, which comes from our bodies, which comes from warm surfaces, gets rejected back to outside. That is shown as the red long wavelength light. Now, that, as you can see there, is getting reflected back inside. Now, in wintertime, this is fantastic, because what it means is that when you open the curtains in that cold frosty morning, if you live down south, or just the cold morning if you live in the north, that you would normally expect in your 1980s house, when you open those curtains and it's cold outside, that you are going to feel cold next to that window. With low E, it significantly reduces that cold effect that you feel through the window. Why? Because your own warmth is getting radiated back to you. You are no longer really being exposed to that cold, cold surface radiating against your skin and body. That is the big difference that people find with low E glazing, especially in winter. In summer, you might be able to imagine that the converse is true. It's fantastic at letting the heat in, but it's really not so good at getting the heat out. So your house might cook, especially for western facing windows in the afternoon. Your house will just bake with low E. So you must be very, very careful in westerly facing windows that you have some control over low E. One of those controls is reflective coatings on the outside. Now, a lot of architects don't like this. There are some rules around some developments in some new subdivisions where you are only allowed to go for certain tints on the windows or certain levels of reflectance. It's not a free-for-all in all locations. Okay, so you've decided to go for low E. That's fantastic. What that means is in winter you're going to be really nice and warm. When you open up those curtains in those cold mornings, you're going to stand next to the windows and you won't feel the cold anywhere near as what you would with just standard double glazed windows, and certainly nothing like you would with just single glazed. But what it means in summer, as the sun comes in, that's really going to heat your space for those west facing windows. Now, why is it an issue in summer for west facing? Why not in the middle of the day, north facing? Well, in the middle of the day, the sun is overhead. It's not really coming in your windows unless you've got a giant skylight. Probably not such an issue for you. But the west facing afternoon is the issue. When the sun comes down and you've got that period from about 6 o'clock, 7, 8 o'clock at night where it's just streaming in there, and that can really make you cook. So what are we going to do? How are we going to stop that solar gain coming in and cooking your space? Well, you could stop the sun. How will we do that? Well, you could put some shading, maybe some louvers on the outside of the windows, but then that definitely impacts the level of visibility that you have from your beautiful windows out to the surroundings. You could put some trees in front of it, same issue. There could be a mountain in front of it, that will work, but it depends where your house is going to be. Another way to do it, which is what I did, is to do some mirroring on the outside of the house. So I've got a 70% mirror baked onto the outside of the glass, so it looks reasonably mirrored when you look at the house. Now what this does is rejects the amount of heat that's coming in. So in summertime, I still feel like I'm getting the full amount of sun coming in. It's still nice and bright, it's nice and airy, I've got fantastic views. In winter time, I'm not impacted. It doesn't really reduce the feeling of how bright and airy the space is. But in winter, I'm warm, and in summer, I'm not cooking. I can really handle those temperatures. So that was a good example for me, and that worked really well. The extra cost, as I said before, was around $140 per square metre, and that was for the low E coating, which can be warm in winter, and for the mirroring, which stopped me from cooking in summer. But again, it totally depends on your windows, where they are, how, what size they are, what are they facing, the impacts on the space. Maybe you want a really warm room, so you don't do it. Again, modelling is the absolute key to be able to balance this. What temperature do I want to have in a space? You model it, you pick the type of glass, you look at the result. It's 32 degrees. Okay, maybe we put some mirroring on it. Or maybe we increase one of the window sizes on the south side. What's my temperature now? 31 degrees, better. And I save $2,000 in doing so. That is the benefit of modelling, and that's the critical thing for choosing windows. So remember, low E, fantastic product. Not such an issue in the morning and summer, because by the time your house is warmed up, the sun's overhead, you can generally open the windows. In the middle of the day, not such an issue. At night, well, in the afternoon, as the sun's starting to come down, it can be an issue, and you often aren't in a position to open up those windows and dump some of that heat overnight too. So managing your space, managing your sleep conditions in a west-facing afternoon with low E, be very, very careful with that. We need to talk about another glazing option that is common for suppliers to offer, and that is argon-filled glazing units. What is argon? Argon is an inert gas. Instead of putting air between your panes of glass, you put argon instead. It is supposed to have a higher R value, which reduces the amount of energy that's going to get lost through that window. Now, I don't believe that it's going to make a material difference on how well your window performs in the long term. I have heard anecdotally that it lasts for 8 years and then it runs out. But I want to give an example why I don't think it's that fantastic at reducing the energy loss, and you should be spending your money elsewhere. Let's imagine that you have a jug of water. You're going to have a cup of tea or a coffee, it's boiling away there, and you put your hand quite close to that jug. You are not going to get burnt. If you were to then touch the outside of that metal jug, you would get burnt. So, even the air, which is between your hand and that jug, has got a lower R value than what the argon does. It is still not low enough to be an effective transporter of heat through the air into your hand. So you've got a very hot jug, you've got your hand, you don't want that heat going to your hand. Now, let's say we bring it down to something with a much lower temperature, and we know that energy travels from the hot source to the cold source. If you were going to touch the jug, the heat of the jug would go into your hand, would burn your hand. So let's talk about the windows. The heat of the inside of the house is going to travel to the cold that's outside the house. So we're in Otago, Queenstown, it's cold. Inside the house, let's say it's, 26 degrees inside because you want it set nice and toasty, and outside it's -5. That's only a 30-degree difference. And you're going to tell me that the argon is going to make such a massive difference to that energy traveling through that glass compared to what air would? I don't think so. Not when a small amount of air is not even enough to transfer heat from a very hot jug to a cool hand at many times the difference in air temperature, driving that temperature flow from the warm source inside your house to the outside. So, choice is yours, of course. Model it, that'll tell you the actual answer, but I'm dubious. I would want to get argon on my glass for very, very cheap if I was going to go for it, or I simply just wouldn't do it. I don't have it in my own house. It does get cold here in Christchurch in winter. It does get hot in summer, and it's just not an issue. All right, let's talk about what frame we're going to go with for our windows or glazed doors. What should we do? Should we go for aluminium? Do we go for PVC? Do we go for timber? Or maybe go for a composite frame? There are lots of different options on the market, and each one has got a different performance and a different cost to it. By far, the cheapest and most common one is aluminium frame. The standard double glazed aluminium unit is just the staple for New Zealand buildings now. Doesn't mean it's the right thing, but it's by far the most common. And what that means is that the R value is quite low on the aluminium. It's easy for the heat to transfer through the aluminium from the inside to get to the outside, and what that means is that in winter, your aluminium is going to get cold, and when it's cold, the moisture in the air is going to condense on that, which can be a real pain. Get pools of water happening at the bottom of your windows and on other parts of the frame. So, how do we stop that? Well, we could go for a thermally broken aluminium frame. Now, what the thermally broken one does is it stops, well, it basically puts a break between the frame. So instead of having one piece of aluminium that goes all the way from the inside to the outside, instead we have some insulating material. Could be a piece of rubber, could be neoprene, just depending on what manufacturer is making it and what they're going to make it out of. And what it does is it means that aluminium, that heat can transfer from the aluminium on the inside to the middle of the frame, and then it stops because it's hit an insulator. And the same thing from the outside, it's very cold in winter and the cold comes closer to the middle and then it stops. So it seriously reduces the amount of condensation you're going to get on your glazing, but you do pay a premium for it. So how important is the condensation issue to you will determine whether you go for aluminium thermally broken frame or not. There are some other options too. Timber is a good one. It has got a high R value. It doesn't condense anywhere near as much as your standard aluminium. It is definitely more expensive than a standard aluminium frame, and there is some maintenance with it. You normally have to paint them and then strip the paint off and redo it, like you did in your granddad's house or your parents' house or your own house when you were growing up potentially, or maybe some weatherboard homes that you have right now. Don't know. The other option is PVC frames. Now PVC is the same material that your drain pipe's made out of and some downpipes. It's that really hard plastic stuff. Now it is a good product. It does perform well. It's got a good R value for it. It's definitely more expensive than standard aluminium framing. One thing you have to be really careful though is that you get guarantees on these frames. The UV index is just so high in New Zealand, and PVC, like all plastics, they do get impacted by the UV. So we've got to make sure that they can withstand that. You don't want your windows going brittle and yellow, or the frames of them over time. Doesn't look the nicest. The last one I want to talk about is a composite frame, and composites are usually timber on the inside and aluminium on the outside. So you're using that timber as the thermal break. They are nice looking frames. They don't have the same maintenance issues that you do with just a direct frame, but they do have the better performance. So you've got a really robust frame on the outside. It's going to protect you from the elements. You're seriously reducing the amount of heat loss that goes through the frame itself, reducing the amount of condensation that happens on it as well. So definitely paying a premium for it. But as I say, I keep coming back to this, you've just got to model your house. Work out the thermal performance characteristics of each glazing type, model it, that'll tell you what temperatures you're going to get, how much energy is going to be lost, and the impact on your overall comfort. Right, that pretty much exhausts what I want to say on glazing and glazing units, but the last thing that I really want you to consider is this. Natural ventilation is fantastic. It is a cheap way to dump heat out of a house, to have windows on one side of the house to be able to open up on the other side. Now to do that, you really want to be able to keep your windows on the latch. And most insurance policies will cover you in case of a burglary or whatever if your windows are on the latch. If they're wide open, not so good. If your doors are unlocked and open, not so good. But if your windows are on the latch, that's fine. There are many different options for the handles that you can choose. So make sure you get the ones that you can open a little bit and put down again, and that will stop them from banging closed or swinging open too far. Ideally, the ones with locks in high crime areas and urban places would be good to look at too. But make sure you get the ones that you can put them on the latch to get that ventilation through.